You think a knife in the back from an enemy is the worst pain imaginable? Try having your own flesh and blood twist the blade. They sharpened it with my sweat and my 80-hour work weeks, all while wearing designer labels and toasting champagne to my success. Buckle up. My story of ultimate betrayal and cold-blooded revenge will make you look very differently at the people sitting right across from you at the dinner table. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with no budget to keep operating and bringing you these tales. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating content for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment. My name is Julia Elliott, and I am 25 years old. The chandelier above our table at the most exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago was practically blinding, casting a harsh golden glow over the prime cuts of dry-aged beef and sparkling crystal glasses. Tonight was supposed to be my ultimate triumph. We were gathered in this private dining alcove to celebrate my newly minted master's degree, a piece of heavy parchment I had paid for with years of severe sleep deprivation, crippling anxiety, and pure, unadulterated burnout. Yet, as I sat there in my modest, neatly tailored navy dress, I felt far more like a ghost attending my own wake than the celebrated guest of honor. The air smelled of expensive truffles and roasted garlic, a rich aroma that only made my empty stomach churn with sheer exhaustion. My parents, Richard and Margaret, held court at the head of the long mahogany table, as if they were royalty holding an audience. They were draped in fabrics that cost more than my annual rent, their voices booming over the smooth jazz playing softly in the background. My father swirled a glass of imported red wine, a vintage that likely cost a few $100s a bottle, loudly proclaiming to our captive extended family how they had meticulously forged my exceptional independence. "We always knew tough love was the only answer for her," my mother chimed in, her heavy diamond earrings catching the chandelier's light with every dramatic nod. "We made absolutely sure Julia understood the real value of hard work from day one. Handouts build weak character." They smiled brightly at the approving murmurs of my aunts and uncles, shamelessly soaking up the applause for a parenting strategy that consisted entirely of abandoning me to the wolves while they lived in the lap of luxury. Directly across from me sat my younger sister, Chloe. She was busy ignoring the entire family conversation, completely absorbed in finding the perfect ambient lighting for her latest social media post. She positioned her flawlessly contoured face next to a brand-new, limited edition designer handbag, pouting her glossy lips for the camera lens. My parents had just gifted that extravagant bag to her earlier that morning. Their official reasoning: Chloe needed some moral support because the creative energy in her spacious New York apartment had been feeling a bit stagnant lately, and they wanted to encourage her artistic journey. I forced the corners of my mouth upward, maintaining a polite, heavily practiced smile that failed to reach my eyes. Even the thickest layer of concealer could not hide the dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes, underneath the heavy tablecloth. My hands were clamped together so tightly my knuckles turned white, desperately trying to stop my fingers from trembling. Every single time I blinked, I saw the glaring red numbers of my massive credit card debt flashing behind my eyelids. I felt the physical, crushing weight of those endless, grueling 80-hour weeks at the Nexus Core Dynamics corporate office. I practically lived in that cold, sterile tech building, surviving on stale vending machine coffee and sheer adrenaline just to keep the lights on in my cramped studio and pay my skyrocketing tuition fees. I was running on empty fumes, completely hollowed out by the relentless grind of keeping myself afloat. The only source of genuine warmth at that sprawling table radiated from the seat right next to me. My grandmother, Clara, had just flown in from Seattle specifically to attend this dinner. She smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, a deeply comforting, grounding presence amidst the suffocating pretension of my immediate family. She shifted in her chair, her soft, wrinkled hand reaching out to cover my tense, white-knuckled grip. She patted my hand with deep affection, her wise eyes shining with unspeakable pride. "I am so incredibly proud of you, Julia," she said softly, though her clear voice carried perfectly during a brief lull in the boisterous conversation. "And I am so glad that the $1,200 I sent you every month helped you get by. Sweetheart." Those exact words hung suspended in the air, entirely detached from reality. Time seemed to snap violently in half. The sophisticated low hum of the restaurant completely faded into a sharp, ringing vacuum in my ears. Across the table, the metallic clink of a heavy steak knife abruptly stopped. My father's booming, arrogant laugh caught deep in his throat, freezing his flushed face into a grotesque, paralyzed mask of sheer panic. Beside him, my mother's perfectly manicured fingers went completely slack, letting her pristine white linen napkin flutter down to the carpeted floor in agonizing slow motion. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over our entire end of the table, an atmosphere so thick and toxic you could practically choke on it. I sat perfectly paralyzed. My exhausted brain fought violently to process the specific sequence of words she had just spoken out loud. $1,200, every single month. My mind viciously rewound through the hellscape of the past 5 years. I saw the thousands of agonizing overtime hours staring at glowing monitors, the humiliating, tearful phone calls with aggressive debt collectors, the bitter winters I spent shivering under thin blankets in my apartment because I simply could not afford to turn on the heating. I slowly turned my gaze from my grandmother to my parents. I looked directly at the sudden, naked terror bleeding into my mother and father's eyes, and the horrifying, sickening truth locked into place inside my head like a rusted steel trap. Over the course of 60 months, I had never seen a single solitary cent of that money. The ringing in my ears morphed into a rushing waterfall, dragging my consciousness backward through the dark, suffocating tunnel of the past 5 years. It was a descent into a specific kind of hell, constructed entirely by the two people sitting across the table. I was 20 years old again, sitting on the floor of my cramped dorm room, surrounded by meticulously drawn-up business plans for the software startup I had dreamed of launching since high school. Then came the phone call that shattered my future. I could still hear my father weeping on the other end of the line, a masterful performance of a broken man. He had choked on his words, claiming their business was going under, that they were drowning in insurmountable corporate debt. My mother had taken the receiver, her voice trembling as she begged me for help, swearing they were mere weeks away from foreclosure and losing our childhood home. Like a good, obedient daughter, I had packed up my blueprints and locked my dreams away in a dark drawer. I traded my vision for a gray cubicle at Nexus Core Dynamics, signing my youth away to an entry-level position that demanded 80 hours a week of mind-numbing, soul-crushing labor. The salary was exploitative, barely above the legal minimum, yet every single month, on the first day of the month, I wired exactly $1,000 to my parents' bank account. It was my required contribution to what they called our shared family survival. The memories of those brutal Chicago winters hit me so hard I could almost see my breath pluming in the warm, truffle-scented air of the restaurant. I remembered the biting, merciless wind howling off Lake Michigan and rattling the thin glass of my miserable, drafty apartment. I had kept the heating completely turned off from November to March, just to shave a few dollars off the utility bill. I remembered sleeping in my heavy winter coat, layered under 3 cheap, scratchy blankets, my teeth chattering until my jaw physically ached. My diet had consisted entirely of bruised vegetables, discounted canned beans, and whatever stale pastries I could scavenge from the office break room after endless meetings. I systematically pushed away every friend I had, declining invitations to birthdays, dinners, and simple coffee dates until people simply stopped asking. You cannot maintain a social life when every spare penny and every waking second is sacrificed at the altar of your family's supposed financial ruin. All the while, my parents were feeding me a steady, carefully curated diet of lies about their own sacrifices. "We are tightening our belts so much it hurts," My mother would sigh over the phone, her voice dripping with artificial fatigue. Yet, there were always the mandatory business retreats. They claimed they had to travel to luxury resorts in Aspen or the Maldives to woo potential investors and save the sinking company. I remembered sitting in the dark, scrolling past photos of them holding tropical cocktails on pristine white beaches, desperately trying to convince myself that they were suffering just as much as I was, that these trips were a painful necessity. Then there was Chloe, my darling younger sister, who was somehow entirely exempt from the shared family burden, while I was bleeding myself dry in a cubicle, having panic attacks in the office bathroom. My parents were fully funding her life in a massive, sunlit loft in New York City. Whenever I dared to question how we could afford such an extravagant expense during a severe crisis, my father would quickly shut me down. "Your sister possesses a fragile, creative soul," he would say, his tone heavy with condescension. "She needs a proper, elevated environment to foster her artistic career. We cannot let our financial mistakes ruin her potential." My potential, apparently, was nothing more than acceptable collateral damage. Sitting in the dining alcove, staring at their frozen, terrified faces, the ultimate, horrifying truth finally clicked into place. My parents had not just intercepted and stolen my grandmother's financial support, they had weaponized my love and loyalty against me. They had invented a phantom debt to bleed me dry. They were secretly collecting $1,200 from my grandmother, pocketing every cent of it, and then turning around to emotionally extort another $1,000 directly from my grueling labor. It was a perfectly executed, dual-sided parasitism. I was not a daughter to them. I was a revenue stream, an automated teller machine fueled entirely by manufactured guilt and sleep deprivation. The average person might have screamed. Another daughter might have stood up, flipped the heavy mahogany table, shattered the expensive crystal glasses, and demanded answers right there in the middle of the crowded steakhouse. But the betrayal was too profound, the violation too absolute for something as cheap as a public tantrum. The fiery, burning anger inside my chest rapidly cooled, crystallizing into a glacier of pure, focused malice. The exhausted, broken girl who had walked into this restaurant died in that exact second. I did not break eye contact with my father. I watched the frantic, desperate pleading building in his eyes, silently begging me to play along, begging me not to expose them in front of the extended family. I drew in a slow, measured breath, tamping down the primal urge to reach across the table and wrap my bare hands around his throat. Instead, I turned my head slightly toward my grandmother. I forced the muscles in my face to relax, painting on a smile so chillingly serene it felt like a mask of cracked porcelain. "Yes, Grandma," I said, my voice perfectly steady, carrying a sweet, poisonous conviction. "It really saved my life." The suffocating tension of the steakhouse followed us directly into the plush leather interior of my parents' luxury sedan. The ride back to my apartment was a masterclass in frantic, desperate manipulation. My father gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles mirrored the color of his stark white collar, while my mother twisted her diamond rings in the passenger seat. They did not even wait for the engine to warm up before the barrage of excuses began. "You have to understand, Julia," my father started, his voice dripping with an oily, manufactured sincerity. "That money from your grandmother, we did not just spend it. We funneled every single cent into a high-yield joint savings fund for the family's future." My mother immediately picked up the rehearsed cue. "Exactly, sweetie. The corporate debt was so overwhelming, we had to consolidate all incoming assets to protect our credit score. We were going to surprise you with a massive lump sum payout once the accounts matured. We just did not want to burden you with the complex financial logistics." It was a pathetic, transparent lie, a desperate attempt to gaslight a woman they still viewed as a naive, compliant child. I leaned back against the cool leather headrest and let my face soften into an expression of profound, apologetic guilt. "I am so sorry I froze up at the table," I whispered, injecting a slight, convincing tremble into my voice. You both looked so panicked. I just did not know what to say. I should have trusted that you had a plan. I know how hard you are working to keep this family afloat." The collective sigh of relief in the front seat was practically deafening. I watched their shoulders drop in the rearview mirror. They bought it completely. They actually believed they still held the leash. They dropped me off with a patronizing kiss on the cheek and promises of reviewing the portfolio together soon. But by 6 o'clock the very next morning, while they were likely sleeping off their expensive wine, I was already navigating the security checkpoints at the international airport. I had called in a sudden medical emergency to Human Resources, using my first sick day in half a decade to book the earliest possible direct flight to Seattle. The time for playing the exhausted martyr was over. The time for forensic dismantling had begun. The gray, drizzling skies of Washington state perfectly matched the cold, calculated fury settling into my bones. My grandmother lived in a modest, beautifully kept suburban home. When she opened the heavy oak door, her face lit up with surprise, which instantly melted into deep concern the moment she registered the hard, hollow look in my eyes. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat her down at her sturdy dining table, poured us both a cup of black tea, and methodically laid out the agonizing reality of the last 60 months. I told her about the suffocating phantom debt, my 80-hour work weeks, the unpaid utility bills, and the sheer, unadulterated theft of her monthly support. I expected tears. I expected a frail, elderly woman to break down in heartbreak. I had severely underestimated Clara. The shock on her face lasted only a few fleeting moments before it hardened into a look of absolute, terrifying outrage. My grandmother was not just a sweet old lady who smelled of lavender. She was a retired chief financial officer who had spent 40 years auditing corporate empires. She did not cry. She simply placed her teacup down with a sharp, definitive clink, walked over to her study, and pulled out her heavy encrypted laptop. "Let us see exactly where my money went," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. We spent the next 48 hours submerged in a deep, digital labyrinth of public records, tax filings, and property registries. With my background in data systems and her razor-sharp accounting instincts, we were a lethal combination. It did not take long for the fragile house of cards to collapse under our scrutiny. We uncovered a sophisticated shell company registered in Delaware under the name RM Holdings. It was a classic, textbook money laundering vehicle. Richard and Margaret had systematically diverted my grandmother's monthly transfers and the bulk of my grueling tech salary directly into this corporate entity. From there, the funds were sanitized and converted into high-yield real estate assets. Every single luxury they flaunted was tied to this phantom corporation. That sprawling vacation villa they visited last winter, owned by RM Holdings, the lease for Chloe's absurdly expensive New York loft, paid by RM Holdings. Even the brand-new luxury car my sister drove was registered as a corporate fleet vehicle. They had masterfully bypassed personal income taxes, writing off their lavish lifestyle as legitimate business expenses while legally claiming to be entirely broke. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Sitting in the glow of the laptop screen, surrounded by stacks of printed ledgers and property deeds, my grandmother asked me if I wanted to contact the authorities right then and there to demand restitution. I looked at the undeniable proof of my stolen youth spread across the table. Merely suing them for the money felt disgustingly inadequate. Recovering the funds would just be a simple transaction, a slap on the wrist for people who had cheerfully watched me starve. I did not just want my money back. I wanted to systematically dismantle the fraudulent empire of prestige they had built on my broken back. I wanted to strip them of their reputation, their freedom, and their golden child. The revenge needed to be as public and as devastating as the illusion they had sold to the world. I returned to Chicago exactly 48 hours later, wearing a meticulously ironed silk blouse and a bright, eager expression that I had obsessively practiced in the tiny mirror of the airplane bathroom. I invited my parents to a highly exclusive cafe in the Gold Coast neighborhood, insisting with a sweet smile that the extravagant coffees and imported pastries were entirely on me. When they slid into the plush velvet booth across from me, they looked cautiously optimistic. They were clearly expecting another tearful apology for my temporary lapse in composure at the steakhouse, ready to graciously accept my submission. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting down to negotiate with their own executioner. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the ambient noise of clinking porcelain and soft jazz stretch the silence just long enough to make them lean forward in anticipation. "I have some truly incredible news," I began, letting my voice brim with a breathless, manufactured excitement. Nexus Core Dynamics just finalized my promotion to Senior Systems Engineer, and with it came a massive vested stock bonus. We are talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. I watched the exact, terrifying moment the pure greed hijacked their nervous systems. My father's pupils physically dilated behind his designer glasses. My mother's perfectly manicured hand twitched instinctively toward her expensive leather handbag. They tried to mask their ravenous hunger with expressions of beaming parental pride, but it was exactly like watching two starving wolves trying to smile warmly at a bleeding lamb. "That is absolutely spectacular news, sweetheart," my father said, his voice smooth, resonant, and heavily buttered with fake affection. "All your relentless hard work is finally paying off. We always knew you had this exceptional, undeniable drive inside you." "Thank you," I replied, beaming right back at him with wide, innocent eyes. "But sitting on that much liquid capital just feels foolish. I want it to grow, and after our long conversation in the car the other night, I realized something important. You two have sacrificed everything to keep this family afloat. I want to put my entire bonus directly into RM Holdings. I want to become an active investment partner and help build our family legacy." The bait was incredibly rich, dripping with absolute, unconditional submission. I was willingly offering them my biggest, most lucrative paycheck yet on a silver platter. The sheer, blinding arrogance of my parents made them completely oblivious to the trap. They did not see a daughter finally stepping into her own power. They saw a permanent, self-replenishing gold mine volunteering for another shift. "Oh, my darling girl," my mother cooed softly, reaching across the marble table to squeeze my hand with her cold fingers. "That is the most mature, beautiful decision you have ever made, but we run a very tight, highly professional ship. We would want you to feel entirely secure and confident about exactly where your hard-earned money is going." "Exactly," my father chimed in quickly, already pulling out his sleek silver tablet from his briefcase. "We will grant you administrative access to our internal financial reports, just a read-only viewing portal, of course, so you can review our quarterly projections and active vendor contracts. You will see firsthand how incredibly robust the company truly is right now." I nodded enthusiastically, profusely thanking them for their transparency and trust. They honestly thought they were throwing me a tiny, insignificant bone to keep me docile and compliant. They had absolutely no comprehension of what a senior systems engineer at a major tech conglomerate could actually do with a simple administrative login. The exact second they handed me those server credentials, they did not just open the front door to their dirty secrets. They willingly handed me the matches and the gasoline to burn their entire fabricated lives to the ground. Late that night, sitting in the cold blue glow of my apartment, I logged directly into the RM Holdings network. The digital security was laughably primitive, clearly set up by someone who bought an off-the-shelf software package. It took me less than 15 minutes of running basic bypass scripts to shatter their basic firewalls and grant myself full, unrestricted access to the deepest, most secure back-end directories of their private server. It was an absolute goldmine of criminal arrogance. My fingers flew frantically across the mechanical keyboard as I initiated a massive, heavily encrypted download of their entire financial history. I watched gigabytes of devastating, undeniable evidence flow directly onto my secured external hard drives. Every single lie was perfectly documented. I found the extravagant expense reports where my mother categorized a $50,000 shopping spree at luxury boutiques in Paris as client acquisition resources. I found the monthly wire transfers paying for Chloe's absurdly high rent in New York City, falsely filed under Northeastern Regional Office maintenance. Every single drop of my sweat, every freezing night I spent shivering under thin blankets, was quantified in these digital folders as their personal, unlimited playground fund. But as I dug much deeper into the locked corporate collateral files, my blood suddenly turned to solid ice. I opened a high-resolution scanned document labeled as a secondary capital acquisition loan. It was a heavy, incredibly high-risk commercial mortgage taken out exactly 2 years ago to secure a massive influx of cash for a failing commercial real estate venture. I scrolled rapidly down to the collateral section, and my breath violently caught in my throat. They had put down my grandmother's house in Seattle. I stared blankly at the glowing monitor, my heart pounding a frantic, bruising rhythm against my ribs. I zoomed in tightly on the final page of the contract. There, sitting neatly on the dotted line, was Clara's signature. I knew my grandmother's handwriting intimately. I knew the slight tremble in her cursive, the specific way she looped her capital letters. The signature on this screen was a flawless, meticulously practiced forgery. It was too smooth, too perfect. They had not just stolen her monthly allowance, they had secretly leveraged the only home she had ever known, risking her absolute, catastrophic ruin if their reckless investments went sour. This was no longer just a case of severe, prolonged financial abuse. This was a massive, federal felony. They were perfectly willing to let their own elderly mother die homeless on the streets just to fund their pathetic, desperate charade of wealth. The sheer, unimaginable scale of their depravity permanently stripped away any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously harbored. They were not my parents. They were sociopathic monsters wearing tailored designer suits. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap, the hard drive humming quietly with enough legal ammunition to put them both in federal prison for decades. But simply handing this over to a quiet, boring courtroom was completely out of the question. They thrived entirely on their social standing. They worshipped their prestige, their exclusive country club memberships, and the envious stares of their wealthy peers. If I was going to destroy them, I had to do it on their absolute favorite stage. I picked up my phone and immediately began drafting an email to the most exclusive, high-end contemporary art gallery in the city. Next month marked my parents' 30th wedding anniversary. It was the perfect, wonderfully poetic occasion. I was going to throw them a massive, lavish tribute gala. I would invite every single one of their business partners, all of our extended family, their wealthy friends, and even the minor internet celebrities Chloe constantly paraded around on social media. I would build them the most beautiful, glittering, towering pedestal imaginable, just so I could violently kick it out from under them while the whole world watched them fall. Convincing my parents to move their milestone 30th wedding anniversary gala from Chicago to a sprawling, ultra-modern art gallery in the heart of Silicon Valley was effortlessly simple. I merely had to whisper the words venture capital, tech billionaires, and networking opportunities, and they immediately packed their finest bespoke suits and designer gowns. I rented out an exclusive, invitation-only contemporary art space in downtown Palo Alto. The venue was a breathtaking cathedral of polished concrete, soaring glass panels, and abstract sculptures that cost more than most working-class families would earn in an entire lifetime. I spared absolutely no expense, utilizing the very last of my available credit lines to fund this spectacular glittering theater of deception. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the gallery was packed with over 300 elegantly dressed guests. The air was thick with the scent of expensive orchids, imported perfumes, and the sharp, crisp aroma of top-tier champagne. I had meticulously curated the guest list. I invited every single one of my parents' high-profile business partners, all of our wealthy extended relatives, and a massive swarm of Chloe's superficial, minor internet celebrity friends who spent the entire evening snapping photographs of themselves in front of the art installations. Richard and Margaret were in their absolute element, radiating a sickeningly smug aura of triumph. They floated gracefully from group to group, their crystal flutes clinking endlessly. I watched from the shadows near the bar, as my father enthusiastically cornered a group of real estate developers, loudly bragging about my recent corporate promotion. He proudly announced to anyone who would listen that his brilliant, future chief executive officer daughter was preparing to inject hundreds of thousands of dollars in fresh equity into their family holding company. My mother stood right beside him, nodding graciously, playing the role of the humble matriarch who had sacrificed everything to raise such a successful, devoted child. They were completely intoxicated by their own fabricated prestige. They had absolutely no idea that exactly 800 miles north in Seattle, a very different kind of gathering was taking place. My grandmother Clara was not spending her evening knitting or reading. She was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table inside the offices of the most ruthless, highly feared corporate litigation firm in the Pacific Northwest. Over the past 3 weeks, Clara and her team of elite financial attorneys had taken the encrypted server logs, the forged signatures, and the undeniable proof of money laundering I had extracted from the company servers, and they had quietly built an inescapable legal guillotine. While my parents were busy eating caviar and boasting about their wealth, a federal judge was reviewing an emergency injunction. At that exact moment, a binding, irreversible legal order was being executed to completely freeze every single bank account, property deed, and shell corporation tied to my parents' names. Oblivious to the financial apocalypse descending upon them, the party raged on. I quietly slipped away from the crowded main floor and stepped into the audio-visual control booth, hidden at the back of the gallery. The technician smiled at me as I handed him a sleek silver flash drive. I told him it was a deeply sentimental family tribute video I had personally edited for the anniversary toast. In reality, it was a highly encrypted, automated presentation perfectly synchronized to my command. At exactly 9 o'clock, the string quartet stopped playing. The low ambient lighting of the gallery shifted, drawing everyone's attention to the elevated main stage positioned in front of a massive blank projection wall. The crowd murmured in anticipation as my father, his face flushed with expensive alcohol and boundless arrogance, confidently stepped up to the acrylic podium. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned into the microphone. "Family," my father began, his deep, resonant voice echoing through the silent gallery. "Family is the absolute, unshakable cornerstone of every great empire. 30 years ago, Margaret and I started with nothing but a shared vision and a profound, mutual dedication to hard work. We faced insurmountable challenges. We weathered brutal economic storms, but we always put our ethics and our family first. We built our success on a foundation of integrity, and we passed those vital, uncompromising values down to our beautiful daughters." He gestured expansively toward where I was standing near the front row. The entire room erupted into polite, admiring applause. Chloe wiped a completely fake, theatrical tear from her carefully contoured cheek for the benefit of her phone camera. My mother blew me a kiss from the stage. I smiled. It was a wide, radiant, terrifying smile. I gracefully climbed the short flight of stairs to the stage. My father proudly handed me the microphone. Stepping back to wrap his arm lovingly around my mother, I looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, the judgmental relatives, and the social media influencers. I had their complete, undivided attention. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice remarkably steady, ringing crystal clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Your speech about sacrifice and business ethics was truly moving. In fact, it inspired me. For your 30th anniversary, I wanted to give you a very special gift. I wanted to present a clear, undeniable monument to your life's work. I wanted everyone in this room to see the exact, literal cost of your great empire." I reached into my pocket and pressed the single, tactile button on the remote control hidden in my palm. Instantly, the gallery lights plunged into absolute darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A split second later, the massive cinema-sized projector screen behind us violently flared to life. The blinding white light illuminated the shocked faces of the audience. There were no nostalgic childhood photographs. There was no romantic music. Instead, towering 20 feet high above my parents' heads, was a painfully high-resolution scan of their private, offshore banking statements. The screen was plastered with rows upon rows of transactional data. Every single fraudulent purchase, every laundered wire transfer, and every stolen deposit was highlighted in a glaring neon red. The numbers were massive, undeniable, and completely exposed for the entire world to read. "If you look at the columns highlighted in red," I announced, my voice slicing effortlessly through the horrified silence of the gallery, "you will see the exact trajectory of my family's incredible work ethic. Specifically, you will notice the $1,200 stolen every single month from an elderly woman's pension fund, sitting right next to the $1,000 extorted from my entry-level salary. Follow that line across the screen, and you will see it perfectly funds a 2-week luxury vacation in the Maldives and a $50,000 Parisian shopping spree." The reaction was instantaneous and completely devastating. The prominent venture capitalists and real estate developers my father had been courting all evening physically stepped away from him, their faces twisting in absolute disgust. The quiet whispers escalated into a chaotic, condemning roar. "Turn that screen off right now," my mother shrieked, her carefully cultivated elegance completely dissolving into a frantic, ugly panic. My father's face turned a violent, dark shade of purple. He lunged toward the stage, his hands reaching out to rip the microphone from my grip. He did not make it past the first step. 2 towering private security guards, whom I had hired and briefed extensively the week before, immediately intercepted him. They shoved him hard against the acrylic podium, pinning him firmly in place. Then, the crowd abruptly parted. From the very front row, a figure stepped forward. It was my grandmother, Clara. She had quietly flown down from Seattle the moment the judge signed the orders, slipping into the gallery completely unnoticed. She walked directly up to my father, her posture rigidly straight, and threw a heavy, thick manila folder directly at his expensive leather shoes. "Those are the federal indictment papers for massive financial fraud and the deliberate forgery of my signature on a commercial mortgage," Clara declared, her voice ringing out with the absolute authority of a judge delivering a death sentence. "As of exactly 1 hour ago, every single bank account, property, and asset tied to RM Holdings has been completely frozen by a federal court. You have absolutely nothing left. Richard, and you are both going to prison." A sharp hysterical wail suddenly pierced the air from the back of the room. Chloe was frantically tapping at her glowing phone screen, tears streaming down her contoured face, completely ruining her perfect makeup. "My black cards are declining," she sobbed loudly, entirely oblivious to the gravity of the criminal charges falling upon her parents. "Everything is locked. My accounts are gone." It took less than 10 minutes. In under 10 minutes, the entire glittering, impenetrable fortress of the Elliott family completely crumbled into dust. I stood on the stage for one final moment, looking down at the utter wreckage. My father was hyperventilating against the podium. My mother was weeping hysterically on the polished concrete floor, and their elite peers were already rushing toward the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt entirely, wonderfully light. I handed the microphone to the nearest security guard. I did not bother looking back. I walked calmly through the chaotic gallery, stepped out into the cool, crisp California night air, and slid into the back seat of a waiting black town car. As the driver pulled away from the curb, heading toward the airport, I looked at the sleek silver briefcase resting next to me. It contained the recovered seed money my grandmother had legally reclaimed and transferred to me just this morning. I smiled softly to myself, watching the city lights blur past the window, finally ready to build my own software company in a brand new city. I was finally free. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and tell me. As our channel is currently demonetized by YouTube, we rely entirely on your kindness. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us with just $1. You can support us by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your contribution pays the salaries of our dedicated team, helping them provide for their families and allowing us to keep creating even better stories to entertain you. Thank you again, and see you next time.